We are now in Chapter 12, Part 3, and we're continuing our conversation on the merchandise planning process. So far in Chapter 12, we've introduced the different categories of merchandise: staple merchandise, fashion merchandise, and seasonal merchandise. And we've looked at the first few steps in the merchandise planning process. We started by talking about how to forecast category sales. Then we looked at how to develop an assortment plan. And we left off talking about setting inventory and product availability levels. So, in our discussion on product availability levels, we talked about how it's not always necessary to meet 100% of consumer demand, and that was our discussion around product availability. There's one other topic we need to consider when we're talking about setting our inventory levels, and that is safety stock. Safety stock is stock that's available to the retailers so that they will not have a stock out if the demand is higher than forecasted. Now, safety stock is really important because we don't want to stock out. So this is the combination of merchandise that's on the floor and then the merchandise that is available in the back room of a retail store. So if you've ever gone to a retail store and a product was out on a shelf and you asked the retailer if they had more and they said yes and they were able to go back to the back room and get you one, they pulled that item from the safety stock. So retailers have to choose an appropriate amount of safety stock, or what we refer to as backup stock, because they need to make sure that they aren't losing sales. But choosing the appropriate amount of safety stock is really difficult. And if you think about it, if your safety stock is too low, you're going to lose sales and customers because you can't meet demand. But if your safety stock is too high, you're using scarce financial resources on inventory that could be more profitably invested into other products, so a higher variety of products or more assortment of products. So setting that number is a really critical piece in the merchandise planning process. And when we're looking at safety stock, this brings us to step 4, which is establishing a control system for your inventory. With staple merchandise, you have to look at a couple of different things, right? So you have to look at the product availability that you want to provide. You have to consider fluctuations in demand for your product, and you also have to consider lead time. And so there's a really fine balance between having too much and too little safety stock. So when you are trying to set the safety stock for staple merchandise, you are working with what we call the order point. And with the order point, it's done mostly automatically by the system, but as a merchandise buyer, there's a few things that you have to do first. So you do have to determine how much you plan to have in your basic stock. And then you also have to determine the level of inventory. So those two items are done by a human employee. So a person is actually working the numbers to try to determine how much safety stock we need. Once that's entered in the system is going to monitor your inventory levels and then automatically reorder product when the inventory gets below a specified level. So there's an equation here that we're going to look at. The equation is to find the order point. And the order point, the definition of that is the point at which inventory available should not go below. If inventory goes below the order point, the retailer is going to run out of stock before the next order arrives. And we do not want to run out of stock before our next order arrives in the store. So that order point, the equation looks like this. You take your sales per week, you multiply it by your lead time plus review time, and then you add your safety stock number. So I'm going to give you an example to make that easier to understand. So here's some assumptions based on a product. Let's assume our lead time is 3 weeks, which means once we call the manufacturer, it's going to take them 3 weeks to make our product and ship it to us. Then we put in our review time, which is 1 week. And that's the time that the product is going to spend in our distribution center. So it's that receiving, checking, ticketing, tagging, marking, making sure everything is floor ready. So we have that lead time plus our review time. Let's just say our sales per week, our demand is 100 units, and then we do require 50 units of safety stock in our back room. So if I want to tell the system what the order point is, I put that together like this. My sales per week, my demand is a 100. I'm going to multiply that by my lead time plus my review time, and then I'm going to add my safety stock. Okay. So the order point here for this product is 450 units. And so if I'm a merchandise buyer, that's the number I'm going to put into the system. And so when the system is notified that we are hitting 450 units, they are going to automatically place an order with the manufacturer. So this is all done through the information system that we have at our retail store. And again, it's one of the reasons why it's so critical to have all of your information stored in that information system at your retail store. So that's a discussion on safety stock and the order point. Let's talk about the next step in the merchandise planning process, which is allocating merchandise to stores. So once you at the retailer have planned the merchandise for the categories, the next step is to start allocating it. And allocation decisions have a much bigger impact on profitability than the overall merchandise purchases the buyer makes. So you might purchase, if you're Target, you might purchase 1 million purple t-shirts to be sent out to your stores. But the next decision, which is how many purple t-shirts do you send to each of your stores, becomes very critical. And allocation involves 3 major decisions. The first one being how much to allocate to each store. And that's mostly based on prior year's sales volume for all of your merchandise categories. And then it's, of course, also based on physical store space. A second question is what varieties of merchandise to allocate to each store. So if you are Kroger, you might order 3 million boxes of cereal. But which varieties of cereal do you need to send to each store? Because it's probably going to be very different. Think back to the segments we talked about in Chapter 4 in terms of the ESRI data, the tapestry data, and think about how that would impact an assortment of cereal. So I'm going to tell you about 2 tapestry segments, and I want you to identify which of the cereals that you see on your screen that they'd be most likely to eat. We have the Rust Belt retirees who are age 60 plus. They live in rural areas. They have grandkids at home or in the neighborhood. And they like to watch TV, read books, and work in their gardens. And then you have a segment called laptops and lattes. And these are young professionals aged 20 to 30, most of them just starting or a few years into their first job. Most have a commute to work. Most own a dog. And most are engaged to be married or newlyweds. So if you think about the cereals, if you're Kroger, how would you send your cereals out? You're probably going to send more bran flakes to your Rust Belt retirees and more organic cereals to the area with laptops and lattes. So your Rust Belt retiree segment is going to get a shipment of lower priced cereals that are more private label, whereas your laptops and latte segment are going to get more of the organic, sugar-free, gluten-free, name brand cereals. So it really does make a difference. Another thing to consider when you're thinking of what varieties of merchandise to allocate to each store is color. Southerners wear more white, pink, and green. Consumers in the North tend to wear more dark fall colors year-round, while consumers in the South wear pastels and florals year-round as well. Monograms are a thing of the South. Monograms are slowly creeping into other parts of the country, but it is generally a Southern fashion trend. Another thing to consider is size. Statistics show that women who live in coastal states wear smaller sizes than women who live in the middle states. So when you're determining what varieties, you have to consider size, color, flavor, style, name brand versus private label to help you determine what variety of merchandise you should send. So the third decision that goes into allocating merchandise is when you should allocate merchandise to the store. Timing is critical for allocating inventory levels. especially for certain types of inventory. So if you look at this exhibit here, and it's exhibit 1212 in your textbook, it plots sales data over time for capri pants in different regions of the country. Capri sales peak in July in the Midwest, and they peak in September in the West, on the West Coast, and that's primarily due to seasonality. So July, August is when the mornings and evenings start getting cooler in the Midwest, but it's not until later in the fall that it starts getting a little cooler in on the West Coast. So you have to allocate product differently based on that. So in addition to seasonality, retailers also have to consider the paycheck cycle. Consumers make their largest purchases at the beginning of the paycheck cycle, which is right after they receive their paycheck. So most Americans are paid every 2 weeks, and then the next most common payment is by month. So if you think about getting a paycheck every 2 weeks on a Friday, spend is highest that first weekend, Saturday, Sunday, and then into Monday, Tuesday. That middle weekend there, purchases are not as high. So retailers plan their shipments and they have their highest levels of inventory at the beginning of the paycheck cycle. So that is all about allocation and the three big decisions. So how much merchandise, what varieties of merchandise, and when to allocate. So those are the three decisions here in terms of allocating merchandise to the stores. And just to reiterate, this is considered step 5 in the merchandise planning process, but a lot of these decisions that we are talking about and a lot of these steps happen at the same time. They're all working through a process, so it's not necessarily the next sequential step. So step 6, you'll notice we jump from step 5 to step 7. Step 6 is actually buying merchandise from your vendor, and we're going to spend the entire chapter 13 lectures on buying merchandise, which is chapter 6. So we're going to skip that step for a second and talk about step 7, which is analyzing your merchandise performance. As with everything, it's very important to analyze performance of your merchandise and make adjustments along the way. And so you have to consider, do you need to order more? Should we order less? Should we bring new products in? Should we take certain products out? All of those decisions kind of happen here in this analysis phase. So your book goes through a few different types of analysis, and we're just going to look at this one here, the ABC analysis. The ABC analysis identifies the performance of individual SKUs in the assortment plan. And what happens is that retailers will put their merchandise into categories, and then they're going to rank those categories based on performance. So I just have up here A, B, C, D. Obviously, working for a national retailer, you're going to have many more categories here, but this will get us started with the conversation. So we have our A items, and generally that's about 5% of our SKUs, and those SKUs make up about 70% of our sales. So if I'm a grocery store, this is my milk, my bread, apples, bananas, the most common products, right? So 5% of SKUs that represent 70% of sales. These are my A items. And then my B items are about 10% of my SKUs, representing 20% of sales. C items, this is the big category. So this is 65% of our SKUs, but they only represent about 10% of our sales. So if I'm thinking about my grocery items again, these might be my cereals, granola bars, Pop-Tarts, because remember, each flavor is a different SKU, right? But we have to carry a very large assortment so that all consumers can get what they need, okay? And then D there, the D items are 20% of our SKUs that represent the bottom 10% of our sales. Okay. Let's do another example. Let's talk about men's dress shirts. So if I'm doing this for men's dress shirts, I might have my A items. And so that might be a long sleeve white button down, a long sleeve blue button down, the two most common colors of men's dress shirts that you'll see because they go with all kinds of ties, right? So those are my A items. There are 5% of SKUs that represent 70% of sales, and I'm going to make sure that those are never out of stock. Okay, so I'm definitely keeping them, and I'm going to make sure they're never out of stock. Then I have my B items, and this is probably my best-selling patterns and colors. So I know that in my store, right, green shirts sell really well, or red shirts sell really well. So I'm going to keep those and make sure that they are also never or rarely out of stock. And those, again, are the 10% of SKUs that represent about 20% of our sales. I just realized that my ABCD represents 110% of sales, but you get where I'm going with this. Then we have our C items, and those might be, in terms of men's dress shirts, shirts that retailers might only carry in certain sizes. So this might be our big and tall section. This might be our short sleeve dress shirts, right? So it's the variety of polka dot patterns, stripe patterns, items, men's dress shirts that the retailer might only use for special orders or things like that. And then the D items, these items have virtually no sales until they get marked down. So it could be like your Hawaiian shirts, right, that are only bought during the summer months or for festival time. But they are the items that have very, very little sales. And so oftentimes a retailer will look at these and decide that they are an unproductive investment and that they detract from the rest of the merchandise and just clutter the shelves. And so generally what's going to happen is that the buyer is going to eliminate these SKUs moving forward. So they will be deleted from stock. And the reason why retailers do this ABC analysis and look at what the 20% of SKUs are and start deleting items from stock, when you delete items from stock, that makes room to bring in new products. And then hopefully those new products will move up into that A, B, or C category as consumers get used to seeing them and purchasing them. So that wraps up step 7 of the merchandise planning process, and also wraps up our conversation in chapter 12. So we've gone through the merchandise planning process steps, except for step 6, which is buying merchandise. And that's what we'll talk about when we get to chapter 13.